The snow was falling hard when two young women vanished into the Colorado darkness on the 6th of January, 1982. In Breckenridge, a mountain town where everyone knew everyone, where doors stayed unlocked and strangers were welcomed with hot coffee, evil was hiding in plain sight. Bobbie Jo Oberholtzer, 29 years old, called her husband Jeff at 7:50 p.m. from the village pub. "Found a ride home, honey," she said, her voice warm against the howling wind. She stepped into the storm wearing her favorite blue jacket, trusting a stranger who offered help. She never made it home. 2 miles away, 21-year-old Annette Schnee finished her housekeeping shift at the Holiday Inn, dreams of becoming a flight attendant dancing in her head. She pulled her orange socks up high, wrapped her scarf tight, and walked into the same deadly night. She, too, would never see morning. By dawn, Jeff was frantic. Search teams found Bobbie Jo's belongings scattered along Hoosier Pass, a bloody glove, her backpack, and one bright orange sock. Hours later, they discovered her body in a snowbank, zip ties around her wrist, a gunshot wound ending her young life. Annette simply disappeared. For months, her family held on to hope until the 3rd of July, when a fishing boy made a horrific discovery. Annette's body lay in a mountain creek, shot in the back, still wearing her clothes. Most chilling of all, one orange sock on her foot, matching the one found near Bobbie Jo. The orange sock murders would haunt Colorado for 40 years. Investigators chased ghosts while families demanded answers. Evil walked free, blending into the community like fresh snow covering old tracks. Then in 2021, genealogy cracked the case wide open, pointing to a shocking suspect, a man once rescued as a hero on that same deadly night. But how could a victim actually be the killer? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. Breckenridge, nestled in Colorado's high country, like a postcard come to life, its Victorian buildings dusted with fresh powder and Main Street lined with glowing shop windows. January 1982 brought the kind of winter that made postcards and broke thermometers, 14 degrees below zero with wind that cut through ski jackets like knives. The village pub buzzed with the familiar rhythm of after-work conversation, locals stamping snow from their boots and wrapping cold hands around hot mugs. Bobbie Jo Oberholtzer wiped down her last table, her shift nearly over. At 29, she carried herself with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in her own skin, someone who knew these mountains and trusted these people. "Getting a ride tonight, Bobbie Jo?" asked her coworker, noticing the storm picking up outside. "Jeff's expecting me, but this weather's getting nasty. Might take someone up on an offer if they're headed my way." The time clock chunked as she punched out at 7:30 p.m. sharp, the mechanical sound marking the end of her last day alive. She gathered her blue jacket and backpack, waved goodbye to the kitchen staff, and stepped toward the door where snow swirled in mini tornadoes each time someone entered. At 7:50 p.m., she used the pub's payphone, feeding quarters into the slot. "Hey, honey, it's me," she said when Jeff answered. "Found a ride home. Should be there soon." Jeff's voice crackled through the connection. "Drive careful. This storm's looking worse by the minute. Will do. Love you." Those would be the last words her husband would ever hear from her. Bobbie Jo hung up the phone, shouldered her pack, and walked into the Colorado night, trusting someone she shouldn't have trusted, accepting help from a man whose darkness matched the storm. Jeff Oberholtzer set 2 plates on their small dining table, the kitchen warm and bright against the howling wind outside. He'd made Bobbie Jo's favorite beef stew with homemade biscuits and opened a bottle of wine to celebrate making it through another January week in the mountains. Their kitchen phone, a yellow rotary model they'd inherited from the previous tenant, sat silent on its wall mount. Jeff glanced at it every few minutes as 8 o'clock became 8:30, then 9. Bobbie Jo was rarely late, especially not without calling. By 9:30, the stew had cooled and the biscuits had hardened. Jeff paced their small living room, pausing at the frost-covered window to peer out at the storm. Snow fell so thick he could barely make out their neighbor's porch light across the yard. The phone's silence felt heavier than the storm. Jeff had watched Bobbie Jo use it hundreds of times, calling her mother in Denver, chatting with friends, always twirling the cord around her finger when she talked. Now it just hung there, mocking him with its quiet. At 10 o'clock, he called the village pub. "This is Jeff Oberholtzer. Is my wife, Bobbie Jo, still there?" "No, Jeff, she left around 8, said she got a ride." "A ride with who?" "Don't know. Some guy offered when she mentioned the weather." Jeff's stomach dropped. Bobbie Jo was cautious but not paranoid. In Breckenridge, accepting rides from locals was as common as borrowing sugar from neighbors. But tonight felt different. The storm made everything dangerous. By 11, Jeff was bundling into his heaviest coat, ready to drive every road between the pub and home. The kitchen phone stared at him from the wall, that cheerful yellow now looking sickly in the lamplight. He touched the receiver once before leaving, whispering, "Ring." Please, just ring. But the phone stayed silent, and Jeff stepped into the storm to search for his missing wife. 2 miles across town, the Holiday Inn's fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune as Annette Schnee pushed her housekeeping cart down the third-floor hallway. At 21, she moved with the quick efficiency of someone who'd learned to make every minute count, someone who saw this job as a stepping stone, not a destination. Her uniform pockets bulged with the tools of her trade key cards, cleaning supplies, and the small notebook where she kept track of her hours. Every dollar mattered when you were saving for flight attendant school, every shift bringing her closer to the dream of traveling beyond these mountains. "Annette, you clocking out?" called Maria from the front desk as she wheeled her cart to the service elevator. "Finally, this storm's getting crazy out there. You got a way home?" Annette glanced toward the lobby windows where snow swirled under the parking lot lights. "I'll figure something out. Maybe catch a ride at the gas station." In the employee locker room, she changed from her uniform into jeans and a wool sweater, pulling on the orange socks that would become her signature in death. They were thick hiking socks, bright as traffic cones, a Christmas gift from her mother who worried about her walking home in the dark. Her work schedule for the week hung on the corkboard by the time clock. Annette Schnee, the 6th of January, 3 to 10 p.m., written in pencil. She punched out at 10:15, 15 minutes late because a guest had requested extra towels just as she was finishing. Outside, the wind hit her like a physical force, snow stinging her cheeks and making her eyes water. She wrapped her scarf tighter and started walking toward Highway 9, hoping to catch a ride before the storm got worse. A pair of headlights approached through the swirling snow, slowing as they neared her. Annette raised her thumb, squinting against the glare, unable to see the driver's face through the frosted windshield. The vehicle stopped, and she hurried forward, grateful for any escape from the brutal cold. Jeff's truck struggled through the deepening snow, its headlights carving weak tunnels through the storm. He drove slowly between the village pub and their house, stopping at every side road and driveway, calling Bobbie Jo's name into the wind. The dinner he'd prepared sat cold on their table, 2 plates that told the story of interrupted plans and growing fear. The beef stew had formed a skin on top, the wine glasses standing empty like sentries, waiting for a celebration that would never come. At midnight, Jeff called the Summit County Sheriff's Department from a payphone outside the Sinclair station. His hands shook as he fed quarters into the slot, though whether from cold or fear, he couldn't tell. "My wife didn't come home from work," he told the dispatcher. "She called around 8 saying she got a ride, but that was 4 hours ago. Sir, adults are allowed to stay out late. Has she done this before?" "No, never, not without calling. And this storm nobody would be out in this unless something was wrong." The dispatcher took Bobbie Jo's description and promised to have a deputy swing by, but Jeff heard the skepticism in her voice. Husbands called about missing wives every weekend, usually after fights or drinking binges. This felt different to him, but he couldn't make her understand that through a phone line. Back home, Jeff sat at the kitchen table, staring at those cooling plates, the silence broken only by wind rattling the windows. Their house felt enormous and empty, every creak and groan amplified by his absence. He picked up Bobbie Jo's wine glass, still showing the faint lipstick mark from the night before when she'd tested the bottle. By 2 a.m., he was back in his truck, driving the same roads in tightening circles, his headlights sweeping across snowdrifts that could hide anything. The storm was erasing all tracks, covering secrets under a white blanket that would preserve them until spring. Dawn broke gray and bitter over Summit County, the storm finally exhausted after dumping 18 inches of snow across the high country. Search teams assembled at the village pub, their voices muted by the weight of what they might find. Jeff stood with them, his face drawn and stubbled, still wearing the same clothes from the night before. He'd never stopped searching, driving mountain roads until his truck got stuck in a drift near Hoosier Pass at 4 a.m. Sheriff's deputies organized the volunteers into groups, assigning each team a section of highway between Breckenridge and Alma. The search for Bobbie Jo Oberholtzer had become official with the sunrise, upgraded from missing person to potential emergency. At 8:30 a.m., a volunteer spotted something dark against the white snow along Highway 9. He called the others over, and they found Bobbie Jo's blue backpack partially buried in a roadside drift, its contents scattered by wind and animals. "Jeff, you need to see this," Deputy Wallace called, his voice careful and controlled. The bloody glove emerged first, leather-stained dark brown and frozen stiff. Then Bobbie Jo's wallet, her driver's license photo smiling up at them from the snow, a tissue with lipstick traces, her house keys on a rabbit's foot keychain, a good luck charm that had run out of luck. But it was the orange sock that stopped everyone cold, bright as a warning flag against the white snow, obviously torn from someone's foot in violence. Jeff stared at it, recognizing the hiking socks Bobbie Jo wore on winter walks, and knew with terrible certainty that his wife was dead. "We need more teams," Sheriff Peterson said quietly, keying his radio, "and we need them now." The scattered belongings told a story of struggle and violence, of a woman fighting for her life on a lonely mountain road. But they also raised the question that would haunt the investigation. If these were here, where was Bobbie Jo? The answer came 6 hours later, delivered with the brutal efficiency that mountains reserve for their darkest secrets. At 2:45 p.m., searcher Tom Bradley was working a section of Hoosier Pass when he spotted what looked like clothing in a drainage ditch beneath the highway. "Found her?" he radioed, his voice breaking on the words. Bobbie Jo lay curled in the snow, her body positioned as if she were simply sleeping. The storm had covered her gently, preserving her in a white cocoon that the afternoon sun was just beginning to melt. She wore the same clothes Jeff had watched her put on that morning: jeans, wool sweater, one orange sock. The zip tie around her left wrist told the story investigators feared to read. This hadn't been a random accident or a moment of passion. Someone had planned this, prepared for this, brought restraints to a murder. Dr. Patricia Mills, the county coroner, examined the body with clinical precision while crime scene photographers documented every angle. The single gunshot wound to the head spoke of execution-style killing, cold and calculated. Time of death, approximately 8:30 to 9:30 last night. Dr. Mills told Sheriff Peterson, single shot, close range. She didn't suffer long. Jeff stood at the perimeter, held back by yellow tape, but close enough to see the shape under the tarp. Friends from the pub surrounded him, their faces reflecting his shock and grief. In a town of 3,000, everyone knew everyone, and Bobbie Jo's murder felt personal to them all. The zip ties puzzled investigators most. They suggested premeditation, a killer who came prepared to restrain victims. In 1982, before the era of criminal profiling and forensic television, such details seemed almost too sinister to believe. As the ambulance carried Bobbie Jo's body down the mountain, snow began falling again, erasing footprints and tire tracks, covering the evidence before investigators could fully process the scene. 2 days passed before anyone noticed that Annette Schnee had vanished into the same storm that claimed Bobbie Jo Oberholtzer. At the Holiday Inn, her supervisor marked her as a no-show for her Thursday shift. Annoyed, but not alarmed. Housekeeping staff sometimes disappeared without notice, especially the younger ones who saw the job as temporary. But when Friday came and went with no word from Annette, her roommate Sarah finally called the sheriff's office. Unlike Bobbie Jo, who had deep roots in Breckenridge, Annette was newer to town, her circle of friends smaller, her absence less immediately noticed. "She never just doesn't show up," Sarah told Deputy Martinez over the phone. "Annette needs this job. She's saving for flight attendant school." The deputy took down the details with growing unease. 21 years old, 5'6", brown hair, last seen leaving the Holiday Inn around 10:15 p.m. on the 6th of January. The same night, Bobbie Jo Oberholtzer was murdered. By Saturday morning, Sheriff Peterson was staring at 2 photographs pinned side by side on the department's bulletin board. Bobbie Jo's driver's license photo showed a confident woman with laugh lines around her eyes. Annette's work ID captured a younger face, more serious, focused on goals beyond these mountains. 2 women, same night, same general area, Peterson muttered to Deputy Wallace. "That's not a coincidence." The investigation expanded immediately. Roadblocks went up on every highway leading out of Summit County. Officers questioned gas station attendants, motel clerks, and anyone who might have given rides on the 6th of January. The storm had limited traffic that night, which should have made witnesses easier to find. But the mountain highways had carried their secrets away in the snow, and Annette Schnee remained missing. Her disappearance transformed the Oberholtzer murder from an isolated tragedy into something far more terrifying: the possibility that a predator was hunting in the Colorado high country. Spring arrived slowly in the mountains, the snowpack releasing its grip, 1 degree at a time. By June, the search for Annette Schnee had shifted from rescue to recovery, though her mother refused to abandon hope. "She's out there somewhere," Helen Schnee told reporters during a press conference at the sheriff's office. "My daughter is a fighter. She wouldn't give up, and neither will I." The months between January and July were marked by false leads and growing frustration. Psychics called claiming to have visions. Hikers reported finding clothing that turned out to belong to other missing persons from other years. The orange sock found near Bobbie Jo's belongings haunted investigators, its mate still unaccounted for somewhere in the wilderness. On the 3rd of July, 1982, 12-year-old Tommy Morrison was fishing Clear Creek near Fairplay when his line snagged on something beneath a fallen log. At first, he thought he'd hooked an old sleeping bag or camping gear. Then he saw the hand. Tommy ran screaming to his father's truck, and within an hour, Park County deputies were wading into the creek. Annette Schnee lay partially submerged in the cold mountain water, her body preserved by the snow melt that had only recently freed her from winter's grip. The orange sock on her left foot stopped everyone who saw it. Bright as a traffic cone, unmistakably matching the one found near Bobbie Jo 6 months earlier, it connected the 2 murders in a way that chilled investigators to the bone. Same caliber bullet, same execution style, same orange socks. Sheriff Peterson told the assembled press. "We're dealing with a serial killer, Dr." Mills confirmed what everyone feared. Annette had been shot in the back while trying to flee, then left in the creek like discarded trash. The Orange Sock murders became Colorado's most notorious unsolved case, 2 young women linked in death by footwear that would become their signature. The investigation into the Orange Sock murders expanded like ripples on a mountain lake, touching every corner of Summit County and beyond. Sheriff Peterson assembled a task force that included investigators from 3 counties, FBI behavioral analysts, and forensic specialists from Denver. The village pub became an unofficial command center, its back room converted into a war room with maps, timelines, and photographs. The evidence board grew daily witness statements, suspect sketches, and always, prominently displayed, those 2 bright orange socks that connected the victims. Detectives canvassed every bar, restaurant, and gas station within 50 miles of Breckenridge. They interviewed hitchhikers, truck drivers, and ski resort workers. They checked gun registrations and mental health records. The investigation consumed thousands of man-hours and produced boxes of files, but no solid suspect. The press dubbed the case the Orange Sock Murders, and the name stuck. Local newspapers ran daily updates, and national news magazines picked up the story. The bright orange socks became symbols of the victims, visual reminders that 2 young women had trusted the wrong person on a snowy January night. Fear settled over the mountain communities like an invisible fog. Parents drove their teenage daughters everywhere. Women traveled in groups, never alone after dark. Hardware stores sold out of deadbolt locks and window alarms. Whoever did this is still out here, Peterson told a packed town hall meeting in August. He's probably someone you know, someone who seems normal. That's what makes him dangerous. The sheriff's words proved prophetic in ways no one could imagine. The killer was indeed someone they knew, someone who walked among them daily, someone who had actually been helped by the very community he had terrorized. But that truth would remain buried for 40 years, hidden beneath layers of misdirection, failed investigations, and the killer's own audacious ability to hide in plain sight. Suspicion is a cancer in small communities, and by autumn 1982, it had metastasized throughout Summit County. Neighbors eyed each other warily, searching for signs of hidden violence in familiar faces. The Orange Sock murders had transformed Breckenridge from a trusting mountain town into a place where everyone was a potential suspect. Jeff Oberholtzer felt the weight of that suspicion more than most. As Bobbie Jo's husband, he occupied the uncomfortable position that statistics dictated the person most likely to have killed her. Detectives interviewed him repeatedly, their questions growing more pointed with each session. "Walk us through that night again, Jeff," Detective Reynolds said during his 7th interrogation. "From the time Bobbie Jo left work until you called it in." Jeff recited the timeline he'd memorized through repetition: the phone call at 7:50, the dinner growing cold, the midnight drive through the storm. But repetition bred suspicion, and his consistency was interpreted as rehearsed lies rather than traumatic truth. The polygraph test came in October, administered by a state expert in a sterile government building in Denver. Jeff sat strapped to the machine, sensors measuring his physiological responses as questions probed the darkest corners of his grief. "Did you kill your wife? Number, do you know who killed your wife? Number, did you harm Bobbie Jo in any way? Number." The results came back inconclusive, not the clear exoneration Jeff had hoped for, but not evidence of guilt either. In the court of public opinion, inconclusive felt like suspicious, and whispers followed him through grocery stores and gas stations. Friends distanced themselves, unsure whether to offer comfort or call police. Jeff's grief became secondary to defending his innocence, his mourning complicated by the need to prove his love for the woman he'd lost. The polygraph papers sat in his case file like a question mark, neither clearing his name nor condemning him, just hanging there for decades like a sword over his head. As 1,983 turned to 1,984, the Orange Sock murders investigation settled into the grinding routine of police work, following leads that led nowhere, pursuing tips that dissolved under scrutiny, and watching evidence grow cold in storage boxes. Detective Reynolds transferred to Denver, frustrated by the case's resistance to solution. His replacement, Detective Patricia Wong, inherited 23 boxes of files, hundreds of witness statements, and 2 families still demanding answers. The crime scene evidence was processed and reprocessed. Bullets were matched to weapon types. Fibers were analyzed. The orange socks were examined under microscopes, their manufacturer identified as a common brand sold in sporting goods stores across Colorado. But 1,000, 984 forensic science couldn't extract DNA from bloodstains or identify perpetrators from microscopic evidence. The investigation depended on witness testimony, physical evidence that could be seen with the naked eye, and the hope that someone, somewhere, would come forward with information. Tips continued to trickle in. A woman in Grand Junction reported seeing two men arguing with a young woman near a gas station. A truck driver claimed he'd given a ride to a nervous man on the 7th of January. A psychiatric patient at the state hospital confessed to the murders, then recanted the next day. Each lead required investigation, documentation, and eventual dismissal. The case files grew thicker while the trail grew colder. Sheriff Peterson retired in 1985, his replacement inheriting the most notorious unsolved case in county history. The evidence board was taken down, photographs filed away, and the Orange Sock murders relegated to periodic review by detectives, with newer cases demanding attention. Jeff Oberholtzer remained under a cloud of suspicion, cleared by logic but never fully exonerated in the community's mind. Annette's mother moved to Texas, unable to bear living so close to the place where her daughter had died. The case that had consumed Summit County for 2 years slowly faded into background noise, another cold case gathering dust in government basements. In a detail that would later seem impossible, the man who committed the Orange Sock murders was dramatically rescued on the same night he killed 2 women. Alan Lee Phillips, a 32-year-old miner, spent the 6th of January, 1982, committing murder and being hailed as a survival hero. The rescue report, filed by Park County Search and Rescue, told a story of resourcefulness and courage. Phillips had been driving home from Breckenridge when his pickup truck slid into a snowbank near Hoosier Pass. Stranded in sub-zero temperatures with the storm intensifying, he used his truck's headlights to signal SOS in Morse code. Rescue coordinator Mike Brennan spotted the signals around 11 p.m. and assembled a team to investigate. They found Phillips nearly hypothermic, his truck buried to the windows in snow, survival dependent on the engine running for heat. He was in bad shape when we got there, Brennan told the local newspaper. Another hour, and we might have lost him. Guys lucky he knew Morse code. The rescue took 3 hours, with volunteers digging Phillips' truck from the snowbank and providing medical attention for exposure. Phillips was treated at the scene, given hot coffee and blankets, then followed home to ensure his safety. The irony was breathtaking in hindsight. While search teams looked for Bobbie Jo Oberholtzer's body, other rescuers were saving her killer's life. While Phillips warmed himself with hot coffee provided by Good Samaritans, his victims lay frozen in ditches and streams. The rescue report noted Phillips' calm demeanor and his gratitude toward the volunteers. He seemed like a decent man in distress, someone deserving of help and sympathy. No one suspected that the person they saved had just committed 2 murders. The rescue story ran in the Summit County Journal alongside early reports of Bobbie Jo's disappearance, the heroic survival tale sharing newspaper space with the beginning of the community's nightmare. Evil and good, documented side by side, with no one recognizing the connection. The 1992nd brought advances in forensic science that offered new hope for cold cases. DNA analysis, once available only to major metropolitan departments, became accessible to smaller agencies willing to send evidence to private laboratories. In 1994, Summit County Sheriff's Department reopened the Orange Sock murders file, hoping that genetic material preserved from the crime scenes could finally identify the killer. Blood from Bobbie Jo's glove and tissue samples from both autopsies were sent to a laboratory in California. The results were disappointing but not surprising. The samples had degraded over 12 years, contaminated by environmental exposure and compromised by 1982 collection techniques. The DNA profiles were partial and inconclusive, useful for elimination, but not identification. Jeff Oberholtzer submitted to DNA testing voluntarily, hoping to finally clear his name. The comparison excluded him completely scientific proof of what he'd maintained for over a decade. The polygraph papers that had haunted him were supplemented by genetic evidence of his innocence. I always knew Jeff didn't do it, Bobbie Jo's sister told reporters, but it's good to have science prove what our hearts already knew. The DNA testing cleared Jeff, but provided no new suspects. Without a sample to compare against, the genetic profiles from the crime scene remained identification in search of an owner. Detective Wong, now promoted to sergeant, reviewed the case files with fresh eyes and modern techniques. She had crime scene photographs digitized and evidence re-examined with better lighting and magnification. She interviewed surviving witnesses again, hoping that time might have loosened memories or guilty consciences. But the Orange Sock murders remained stubbornly unsolved, the case files growing thicker with each review but no closer to resolution. The evidence sat in climate-controlled storage, waiting for technology or luck to bridge the gap between proof and justice. The investigation had cleared the innocent but failed to identify the guilty, leaving families still waiting for answers as the millennium approached. The year 2000 marked the 18th anniversary of the Orange Sock murders, and Summit County Sheriff's Department conducted another comprehensive review of the case. Detective Sarah Kim, newly assigned to cold cases, spread the evidence across conference room tables, like pieces of a puzzle that refused to form a complete picture. The millennium brought new computer databases, improved communication between agencies, and the hope that fresh perspective might unlock old secrets. Kim digitized witness statements, cross-referenced similar crimes in neighboring states, and built comprehensive timelines that tracked every person of interest. Her cold case review file grew thick with new theories and updated analyses. She consulted with FBI profilers who described the killer as organized, familiar with the local area, and comfortable enough with the community to blend in seamlessly. Someone with local knowledge, possibly employed in mining or construction, who owned firearms and had experience with restraints. The profile pointed toward dozens of potential suspects, but without DNA matches or witness identifications, it remained educated speculation. Kim interviewed surviving family members, reviewed employment records from local mines, and tracked down men who had left the area after 1982. Each lead consumed weeks of investigation and produced nothing actionable. The killer had vanished as completely as if he'd never existed, leaving only his victims' bodies and those haunting orange socks as evidence of his presence. Whoever did this was smart, Kim told her supervisor. He knew how to avoid leaving evidence, how to choose victims who wouldn't be missed immediately, and how to disappear afterward. This wasn't random violence, it was calculated predation. The case files returned to storage at the end of 2001. Supplemented by Kim's analysis but no closer to solution. The Orange Sock murders had officially become one of Colorado's most enduring mysteries, resistant to advances in technology and investigative techniques. The evidence waited patiently in its boxes, preserved and cataloged, ready for the breakthrough that seemed perpetually just out of reach. Annette Schnee never stopped believing that justice would eventually find her daughter's killer. Even after moving to Texas, she maintained correspondence with Colorado investigators, called on anniversaries of the murders, and kept Annette's memory alive through interviews with journalists who periodically revisited the case. Jeff Oberholtzer built a quieter life, remarrying in 1989 and moving to a ranch outside Breckenridge. But he never forgot Bobbie Jo, and he never stopped hoping that someone would be held accountable for her death. He spoke to reporters when they called, participated in documentary films about cold cases, and maintained that somewhere, someone knew the truth. Memorial flowers appeared each year at the sites where the women's bodies were found. Helen made the pilgrimage from Texas every July, placing daisies near the creek where Annette was discovered. Anonymous mourners left roses and carnations along Hoosier Pass where Bobbie Jo's belongings were scattered. The Summit County Victims' Rights Organization established an annual memorial service on the 6th of January, gathering families and community members to remember not just Bobbie Jo and Annette, but all victims of unsolved crimes. The orange sock became an unofficial symbol of their cause, representing the persistence of memory and the demand for justice. Local newspapers ran anniversary stories each January, keeping the case in public consciousness even as leads dried up and investigators moved on to newer crimes. The stories always ended the same way. If you have information about the Orange Sock murders, please contact the Summit County Sheriff's Department. Tips still trickled in occasionally, usually from people who had moved away and suddenly remembered something, or from amateur investigators who thought they'd spot patterns that professionals had missed. Each tip was logged, investigated, and filed away when it led nowhere. Someone knows, Helen whispered to Annette's grave marker during her 2015 visit. Someone out there knows who did this, and someday they'll tell. Her faith would prove prophetic, though she wouldn't live to see it fulfilled. In 2020, nearly 40 years after the Orange Sock murders, Park County Detective Sergeant Wendy Kipple inherited a basement full of cold cases and a directive to explore new forensic technologies. Genetic genealogy had recently solved several high-profile cases, including the Golden State Killer, and Colorado law enforcement was eager to apply these techniques to their own unsolved crimes. Kipple had joined the department in 2015, bringing a background in forensic science and a reputation for thoroughness that made her ideal for cold case work. She approached each file methodically, evaluating evidence quality and the potential for modern analysis techniques. The Orange Sock murders stood out immediately: two connected homicides with preserved biological evidence and a strong community desire for resolution. The case had everything needed for genetic genealogy analysis: quality DNA samples, detailed evidence documentation, and enough public interest to justify the expense. Working with Parabon Nanolabs, a genetic genealogy company specializing in cold cases, Kipple submitted crime scene DNA samples for SNP single nucleotide polymorphism analysis, This advanced technique could create genetic profiles, even from degraded samples that were unsuitable for traditional DNA testing. The results arrived in November 2020 in the form of a comprehensive genealogical report pointing toward the Phillips family line. The analysis traced DNA markers through multiple generations, identifying potential relatives and building family trees that narrowed to specific individuals. One name appeared repeatedly in the analysis: Alan Lee Phillips, born the Sate 1949, residing in Colorado throughout the 1982nd, employed in mining operations near Breckenridge. The genetic genealogy suggested a high probability match between Phillips and the crime scene DNA. Kipple stared at the report in disbelief. After 40 years of investigation, the answer might be sitting in a computer printout on her desk. But genetic genealogy provided leads, not proof. The real work was just beginning. She pulled Phillips' driver's license photo from state records and studied the face of a man who might have gotten away with murder for 4 decades. Surveillance of Alan Lee Phillips began in December 2020, conducted with the careful patience that 40 years of waiting had taught investigators. At 71, Phillips lived alone in a modest house near Bailey, Colorado, his days structured around retirement routines that seemed utterly ordinary. Detective Kipple and her team documented Phillips's movements: grocery shopping on Thursdays, coffee at the same diner each morning, visits to the library where he read newspapers and Western novels. He appeared to be exactly what he seemed, a retired miner living quietly in the mountains, bothering no one. But genetic genealogy had pointed investigators toward Phillips with statistical confidence that approached certainty. The DNA profile from Bobbie Jo's glove shared enough markers with Phillips' genetic signature to make coincidence virtually impossible. The challenge was obtaining a direct DNA sample for comparison without alerting Phillips to the investigation. Colorado law allowed collection of discarded DNA from public spaces, but Phillips was careful with his trash and rarely ate at restaurants where utensils might be recovered. The breakthrough came on the 15th of January, 2021, at a Sonic drive-in in Littleton, where Phillips had stopped for lunch. Detective Kipple watched from an unmarked car as he ate a hamburger and drank a large Coca-Cola, then tossed the paper napkin and plastic cup into a trash receptacle. "That's our sample," Kipple radioed to her backup team. The napkin and cup were retrieved within minutes and rushed to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation laboratory for emergency DNA analysis. The wait for results felt eternal to investigators who had been chasing this case for decades. On the 28th of January, 2021, the laboratory confirmed what genetic genealogy had predicted. Alan Lee Phillips' DNA was a definitive match to biological evidence from the Orange Sock murders crime scene. After 39 years, the killer had been identified. Now came the harder task: proving his guilt beyond reasonable doubt and bringing him to justice. The arrest warrant for Alan Lee Phillips was signed on the 23rd of February, 2021, charging him with 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of kidnapping, and multiple counts of felony murder in connection with the deaths of Barbara Oberholtzer and Annette Schnee. Detective Kipple assembled a tactical team for the arrest, unsure how a 71-year-old man might react to being confronted with evidence of murders committed nearly 4 decades earlier. Phillips had lived as a free man for longer than most people had been alive, his secret preserved by time and circumstance. The arrest occurred at 6:30 a.m. on the 24th of February, as Phillips was leaving his house for his regular morning coffee. Multiple patrol units surrounded his driveway, officers positioned to prevent any attempt at flight or violence. "Alan Lee Phillips, you're under arrest for the murders of Barbara Oberholtzer and Annette Schnee," Kipple announced as Phillips stood frozen beside his truck, coffee mug still in hand. He didn't resist, didn't protest innocence, didn't ask questions. Phillips simply set down his mug and extended his hands for handcuffs, as if he'd been expecting this moment for 39 years. News of the arrest spread across Colorado within hours. Local television stations interrupted regular programming with breaking news alerts. Social media exploded with shock, relief, and speculation about how the case had finally been solved. Jeff Oberholtzer was in his kitchen when Detective Kipple called with the news. "We got him, Jeff. After all these years, we got him." Jeff set down the phone and wept for Bobbie Jo, for Annette, for the decades of waiting and wondering. The call he'd hoped to receive for nearly 40 years had finally come, though it brought more relief than joy. Helen Schnee had died in 2019, 2 years before her daughter's killer was identified. She went to her grave still believing justice would eventually come, though she wouldn't live to see it. Preparing Alan Lee Phillips for trial required assembling 4 decades of evidence into a coherent prosecutorial strategy. Park County District Attorney Linda Stanley inherited boxes of physical evidence, witness statements from people who were now elderly or deceased, and crime scene photographs that documented murders from an era when forensic science was primitive. The genetic genealogy evidence was compelling but complex, requiring expert testimony to explain DNA analysis techniques that didn't exist when the crimes were committed. Jurors would need to understand how genetic markers could identify a killer 39 years after the fact, bridging the gap between 1,982 evidence and 2021 science. Stanley's prosecution team included forensic specialists, DNA experts, and investigators who had worked the case across multiple decades. They faced the challenge of presenting evidence that spanned technological generations while maintaining focus on the central facts. 2 young women had been murdered, and Alan Lee Phillips' DNA proved he was their killer. The defense, led by public defender Molly Kiernan, would likely argue that the DNA evidence was corrupted by time, that genetic genealogy was unreliable, and that Phillips was an elderly man being scapegoated for crimes committed when forensic science was less sophisticated. But the prosecution had more than DNA. They had the orange socks that connected both victims. They had ballistics evidence showing both women were shot with the same type of weapon. They had Phillips's presence in the area on the night of the murders, documented by the rescue report that had once made him seem like a victim. Most damning of all, they had Phillips' behavior after the arrest, his lack of surprise, his failure to protest innocence, his resigned acceptance of handcuffs. Guilty men often confessed through silence, and Phillips' reaction suggested a man who had been carrying this secret for decades. The trial was scheduled for August 2022, giving both sides time to prepare for what would be one of Colorado's most closely watched murder trials. The trial of Alan Lee Phillips began on the 8th of August, 2022, in a Park County courtroom packed with media, family members, and community residents who had waited 4 decades for this moment. Judge Michael Gonsalves presided over proceedings that would determine whether genetic science could deliver justice for crimes committed in an analog age. Opening statements set the tone for a prosecution case built on scientific evidence and a defense strategy focused on reasonable doubt. District Attorney Stanley described Phillips as a predator who had hidden in plain sight for 39 years, using his familiarity with mountain roads and weather conditions to hunt victims and dispose of bodies. The defendant didn't expect science to catch up with him, Stanley told the jury. He thought time would be his ally, that evidence would degrade and memories would fade. But DNA doesn't forget, and justice doesn't have an expiration date. Defense attorney Kiernan acknowledged the tragedy of the murders while questioning the reliability of decades-old evidence. She pointed to contamination possibilities, the chain of custody issues, and the statistical interpretation of genetic genealogy results. The courtroom was filled with familiar faces from an investigation: Detective Kipple, now retired Sheriff Peterson, and Jeff Oberholtzer, who had waited 30 years to see someone charged with his wife's murder. Annette Schnee's relatives occupied an entire row, photographs of their lost family member displayed on the prosecution table. The orange sock took center stage as Exhibit A, preserved in a clear evidence bag, still bright after 4 decades, connecting 2 victims through a piece of fabric that had become iconic in Colorado criminal justice history. Dr. Patricia Mills, the original coroner, testified about the autopsies she had performed as a young medical examiner. Now retired, she walked the jury through findings that had puzzled investigators for decades: the execution-style gunshots, the zip ties, the positioning of bodies that suggested a methodical killer. The most dramatic testimony came from Dr. Ellen Graytack of Parabon Nanolabs, the genetic genealogist who had identified Phillips through DNA family tree analysis. Her presentation transformed complex science into understandable narrative, showing how genetic markers could trace family relationships across generations. DNA is like a molecular fingerprint, Dr. Graytack explained to the jury. Every person inherits unique genetic markers from their parents, grandparents, and ancestors going back thousands of years. Those markers don't change, don't degrade, and don't lie. She walked the jurors through the process of building Phillips's genetic family tree, identifying distant relatives who had submitted DNA to genealogy websites, and narrowing the suspect pool through elimination and confirmation. The statistical probability that someone other than Phillips could be the source of the crime scene DNA was calculated at 1 in several billion. Defense attorney Kiernan challenged the science through cross-examination, questioning the assumptions underlying genetic genealogy and the possibility that contamination or laboratory error could have skewed results. But Dr. Graytack's testimony was methodical and convincing, supported by documentation that traced every step of the analysis. Detective Kipple testified about the investigation that led to Phillips' identification, including the surveillance operation and the collection of DNA from discarded items at the Sonic Drive-In. She described watching Phillips discard the napkin and cup that would ultimately confirm his guilt, evidence obtained through legal means that violated no constitutional protections. The prosecution's case culminated with the presentation of physical evidence: the orange socks, the zip ties, the ballistics reports, and the crime scene photographs that had haunted investigators for decades. Each piece of evidence was carefully explained, its significance documented, its chain of custody verified. Phillips sat silently throughout the testimony, occasionally taking notes but showing no visible emotion as witnesses described the murders he had allegedly committed decades earlier. On the 15th of September, 2022, after 5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. Judge Gonsalves called the court to order as Phillips stood beside his attorneys, his face expressionless as the jury foreman prepared to deliver 40 years of delayed justice. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Barbara Oberholtzer, we find the defendant guilty. Jeff Oberholtzer closed his eyes and felt 40 years of weight lift from his shoulders. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Annette Schnee, we find the defendant guilty. Annette's relatives wept openly, clutching photographs of the young woman they had lost. The guilty verdicts continued through all 8 counts: murder, kidnapping, and felony murder charges that would ensure Phillips would never again walk free. The jury had accepted the scientific evidence, believed the DNA analysis, and concluded that genetic genealogy had identified the orange sock killer. Phillips showed no reaction to the verdicts, sitting quietly as his attorneys requested polling of individual jurors. Each confirmed their guilty verdict, their voices steady and certain. Outside the courthouse, District Attorney Stanley addressed a crowd of reporters and community members who had gathered to hear the outcome. After 39 years, justice has finally been served for Barbara Oberholtzer and Annette Schnee. Their families can now have closure, and our community can finally heal from these terrible crimes. Jeff Oberholtzer spoke briefly to the media, his voice breaking as he talked about Bobbie Jo and the decades of waiting for this moment. She was a wonderful woman who deserved so much more than what happened to her. Today, her killer has been held accountable. The conviction marked the end of one of Colorado's longest-running murder investigations, a case that had spanned technological generations and tested the persistence of families who refused to give up hope. On the 7th of November, 2022, Alan Lee Phillips returned to the Park County Courthouse for sentencing. At 73 years old, he faced the remainder of his life behind bars. The decades of freedom he had stolen from his victims now permanently ended. Judge Gonsalves had reviewed victim impact statements from family members, letters from community members, and pre-sentence reports that detailed Phillips's background and criminal history. The sentencing hearing would be his opportunity to address the court, to explain or apologize or maintain innocence. Phillips waived his right to speak. The defendant's silence speaks volumes, Judge Gonsalves observed. For 39 years, he has lived with the knowledge of what he did to 2 young women whose only crime was trusting a stranger on a snowy night. The sentencing was straightforward: 2 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole, plus additional years for kidnapping and felony murder charges. Phillips would die in prison, never again free to harm anyone. Jeff Oberholtzer addressed the court during victim impact testimony, speaking directly to Phillips for the first and only time. "You took away the most important person in my life. You stole her future, her dreams, and 40 years of happiness we should have shared. But you didn't break me, and you didn't break her memory." Annette's cousin read a statement on behalf of the family. Annette was 21 years old with her whole life ahead of her. She wanted to see the world, to help people, to make a difference. You ended all of that for your own selfish reasons. But today, finally, you're being held accountable. Phillips was led away in shackles, returning to a prison cell where he would spend whatever time remained to him. The Orange Sock murders case was officially closed. The investigation that had consumed 4 decades finally resolved. The families had their justice, delayed but not denied. Alan Lee Phillips died by suicide in his Colorado State Penitentiary cell on the 12th of February, 2023. Just 3 months after beginning his life sentence. Guards found him during a routine morning check, having used a bedsheet to hang himself during the night. The news of Phillips's death triggered mixed reactions from those who had followed the case for decades. Some felt robbed of the satisfaction of watching him serve his full sentence, while others saw his suicide as a final confession, the act of a man who could no longer live with his crimes exposed to the world. Jeff Oberholtzer's reaction was measured. He made his choice, just like he made the choice to murder Bobbie Jo and Annette. "I'm sorry for his family, but I'm not sorry he's gone." Detective Kipple, who had spent years building the case against Phillips, viewed his death as an anticlimax to 4 decades of investigation. We wanted him to face the consequences of his actions, to spend years thinking about what he did. But at least the families got justice, even if it was briefer than we hoped. The suicide raised questions about prison conditions and mental health screening, but it also eliminated any possibility of appeals or attempts to overturn the conviction. Phillips' death certificate listed suicide as the cause, closing the final chapter of his life story with the same violence he had brought to his victims. His body was claimed by distant relatives and buried in an unmarked grave, his name absent from the headstone. The contrast with his victims was stark. Bobbie Jo and Annette were remembered with flowers, memorial services, and the enduring love of families who had never stopped fighting for justice. The Orange Sock murders case file was officially closed on the 15th of February, 2023, stamped "cleared by death" and transferred to permanent archives. On a cold January morning in 2024, 2 years after Phillips' conviction and 1 year after his death, Jeff Oberholtzer returned to the place where Bobbie Jo's belongings were found along Hoosier Pass. He carried a small bouquet of winter roses, their red petals bright against the snow-covered roadside. The memorial plaque installed by the victims' rights organization gleamed in the morning sun, its bronze surface engraved with simple words, "In memory of Barbara Oberholtzer and Annette Schnee, taken too soon, never forgotten." Jeff stood quietly in the cold, remembering the woman he had loved and lost, thinking about the decades of questions that had finally been answered. The investigation had consumed half his lifetime, but it had also given him purpose, keeping Bobbie Jo's memory alive, demanding justice when others might have given up. Detective Kipple drove by on her way to work and stopped to pay her respects. She and Jeff had formed an unlikely friendship through the investigation, bound by their shared commitment to solving the case that had defined both their lives. "She would be proud of you," Kipple told Jeff as they stood beside the memorial. "You never stopped fighting for her." Across Colorado, the Orange Sock murders had become a landmark case in genetic genealogy, cited in law enforcement training and academic papers about cold case investigation. The socks themselves were permanently displayed at the Colorado Bureau of Investigation headquarters, tangible reminders that science could eventually triumph over even the coldest cases. In Breckenridge, life had returned to the trusting rhythms of a mountain community. Doors were unlocked again, strangers were helped without suspicion, and the fear that had gripped the town for 4 decades had finally lifted. The evil that had hidden in plain sight was gone, and justice, though delayed, had finally been served.